You're watching What Happened After here on the History Channel.
Code 3, room 200. I'm in the mayor's office. 1023 for 1 moment.
They were two of the most shocking murders in San Francisco history. Mayor George Moscone and City Council member Harvey Milk shot dead in their own offices. Yet on January 6, 1984, after serving 5 years, 1 month, and 9 days, their killer, Dan White, was released from prison. Justice, according to the courts, had been served. Upon his release, Dan White was sent to the Los Angeles area because authorities feared for his safety in San Francisco. But after a year, he was allowed to return to the Bay Area, where he rented an apartment near his wife and 3 children. Once home, White sought the counsel of his former lawyer, Doug Schmidt.
When he got out, he was just lost. And I recall taking him up to a place I've got up north of here. And he was pretty hot to be around, and I didn't think it was such a good idea that he and I would be seen together in San Francisco, even many years after this had occurred. So I took him up to this place, and I remember he never smiled, and he never had any joy.
White's homecoming in San Francisco was less than cordial. Some locals proudly wore buttons reading, "Off White."
People that loved Dan White prior to the shootings were turning their back on him. He could not handle that. He wanted to be loved. He wanted to be respected.
He couldn't go out in public. People would scream and yell at him.
He was in a black depression. Now, interestingly, I talked with a psychiatrist that had started to treat him for depression weeks before. They were using lithium at the time. Apparently, it was explained to me anyway, that there is a period after a couple of weeks of taking a regimen of lithium wherein one's mood swings down.
It was during one of these mood swings that Dan White took another life. On October 21st, 1985, he taped a garden hose to the exhaust pipe of his family's Buick and ran the other end into the interior of the car. Ironically, Inspector Frank Falzon was on duty again when the call came in that White had been found dead.
Here was Dan White, a very fit, very muscle-toned, handsome young man, laying on the cold concrete, a priest kneeling down over him, giving him the last rites, and 2 nuns kneeling down, praying. And I'm looking around, wondering again, why did any of this have to happen?
You could just tell from what I remember of the scene that he was in absolute agony. He was clutching pictures of his family, and it was a pretty sad affair.
It takes about 10 or 12 years, as if I'm giving a recipe for people. I hardly wish this on anybody. But, you know, it was just a process of absorbing step by step the feelings.
In 1998, at a ceremony marking the 20th anniversary of the assassinations, Jonathan spoke publicly about the loss of his father. He also announced for the first time that he was gay.
I remember how I imagined he'd feel if he knew that I was gay, and only coming up with one answer: proud. The monumental leap I had to take was that when I came out, I was doing it in a relatively public way. And I realized that there's a power in this strange coincidence of the fact that I am gay. My father was the mayor of San Francisco and has a very close relationship in history to one of the preeminent gay politicians of the century.
Any lingering uncertainty about Dan White's intentions on the day of the murders ended with the revelations published by Mike Weiss in San Francisco Magazine in 1998.
After Dan White had been released from prison, he confided in Falzon that he had indeed come down to City Hall on November 27, 1978, with the intention of killing George Moscone and Harvey Milk.
The startling disclosure proved that Dan White had committed premeditated first-degree murder. Yet White's real plan went unfulfilled.
In fact, he had also intended to kill two other politicians. He had intended to kill City Supervisor Carol Ruth Silver, and he had intended to kill then Assemblyman, now Mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown, and take out all his enemies at one time.
Dan White and I sat and talked following his parole, and it was devastating for me again to find out that he had intended to take 4 people out that day, and the 5th one was going to be himself.
We used to say, well, if you had been there, Carol, you would have been dead too. But nobody really took that seriously until Falzone's disclosures that I, too, and Mayor Willie Brown had been targets.
Assemblyman Willie Brown left George Moscone's office only 30 seconds before Dan White entered.
Willie Brown didn't know that until I told him about it. He was very stunned by that. It's not often that anyone hears they escape being killed by about 30 seconds.
You know, as it became a part of history, I began telling this story to many people many times. And I think in the telling, it becomes easier to accept it. You begin to internalize it. And I think that was a big part and a very useful thing.
More than 20 years after the murders in City Hall, the crown jewel has regained some of its sparkle. In 1996, Assemblyman Willie Brown became mayor. And in the 1999 election, he was challenged by the president of the Board of Supervisors, Tom Amiano, a former ally of Harvey Milk.
The great irony there was that, I mean, Willie Brown and George Moscone and Harvey Milk had been the insurgents trying to oust an entrenched power establishment themselves, and then all these years later, Willie is the establishment, and an old sidekick of Harvey's comes along and tries to oust him, and I think it shows the breakup of the Liberal coalition in this town. I mean, there was a time when Milk and Moscone stood together, but in this most recent election, the allies of Milk and the allies of George Moscone were at odds. They were opponents.
Amiano's bid for the mayor's office fell short, but he did win re-election as president of the board.
The murder of Harvey Milk really crystallized in my mind what I needed to do with my life. And that is, you know, to make up for this murder and to express everything that Harvey was expressing and let people know that you can murder the leader, but you're not going to murder their idea.
There's something very reassuring in the fact that people feel that, and they continue to, and they don't forget in this world about people like Harvey or my dad or anybody who has died because of what they've, indirectly or directly because of what they were fighting for.
Coming up, the true story of what